and he was accepted. Not a great pilot, he spent the latter part of 1916 flying anti-Zeppelin patrols over England. Bishop was involved in one of the few recorded duels between great aces of the war. In mid-1917, Bishop's squadron was flying a midday patrol when they spotted 5 albatrosses. As Bishop maneuvered to get behind these, 4 more red-painted albatrosses appeared, von Richthofen's planes. Bishop met the new challengers and all began firing, twisting, turning, and struggling to gain an advantage. Richthofen moved out of the melee, setting up a duel with the Canadian ace. Bishop briefly got the Red Baron in his sights, but his gun jammed. Von Richthofen turned, looked around. Bishop unjammed his machine gun and placed several bullets in the fuselage of the Red Albatross. But the German ace flew masterfully, twisting, banking, and never offering Bishop a clear shot. When 4 Sopwith triplanes from an English naval unit appeared, the Germans took off. With several bullet holes in his aircraft, Bishop remarked, "Close shave, but a wonderful soul-stirring fight." The successes of Bishop and his blue-nosed aircraft were noticed on the German side, and they began referring to him as Hell's Handmaiden. By the end of the war, he had claimed some 72 air victories.
Two, one. Lasers off. Bomb's gone. Bomb's gone. Looking good. 10 seconds.
Shell 4-1, I've got a tally though. I think that's wedged to the south.
4, 3, 2,
My position
1.
for about 10
Should
miles.
be in. Oh, yes! You destroyed that thing bigger than Dallas.
In 1917, as America prepared to enter the Great War, U.S. air power ranked just 14th in the world. America's only trained combat aviators were those flying in France with the famous Lafayette Escadrille. The Lafayette Squadron was formed in April 1916, when American Norman Prince and a group of 7 others were allowed to form a squadron in hopes that it would encourage the United States to enter the war. The American Volunteers were a devil-may-care group that included Ivy League football players, Southwestern Cowboys, and even the son of a former president of the United States. Though they fought bravely, they could not compete with Germany, whose air force dominated the skies over Europe's battlefields. By June, they were thrown into the fighting over the battle at Verdun. Flying 5 patrols a day, all 7 of the original pilots were either killed or wounded by the end of the month. Almost a year after the United States entered the war, the Lafayette Squadron was integrated into the U.S. Army Air Service. Other American pilots serving with the French were also invited to transfer to American units, with the exception of Eugene Jacques Bullard, who was passed over because he was black. In the air, as on the ground, the U.S. was hardly ready to fight a world war.
Believe me, we were far from ready. I was a rookie cadet, I ought to know. They gave us wooden guns and told us we were going to turn the tide. For training equipment, we molded our own bombs out of plaster. Pretty soon we trained with the real things, and having met the ground training requirements, we were issued leather flying togs and helmets. It was a proud day. First, we made a pre-flight check of our bailing wire planes. Then we tried out our wings. 50 hours in the air, a few bombs, and we were ready for advanced training overseas.
America was producing airmen, but it still didn't have a single fighting airplane. Soon, voices began to be raised in Washington advocating the development of U.S. Army air power. Newton Backer, Secretary of War, insisted supremacy of the air in modern warfare is essential. President Woodrow Wilson proposed $600 million to meet the needs of military aviation, and, while Congress debated his request, the newly minted pilots were dispatched over there. Though they went without airplanes, they did go in style. Camouflaged luxury liners like the Leviathan were used as troop ships.
Most of us, half-trained but eager to fight, went to France. There we found cities of wooden barracks and muddy streets. In outdoor classes, we practiced gunnery. Wooden models taught us how to lead an airplane with our fire. Battle-tested aviators took time out from the war to show us how to handle a stick. It was much easier to talk about turning the tide than to produce fighting aces overnight.
Late in 1917, the 1st Aero Squadron was formed under the command of Major Ralph Royce. Royce's men were the first all-American aviation unit to see combat action. They were young and untested, but they did not lack for daring. They proudly pasted paper iron crosses over enemy bullet holes in their aircraft and showed their American pride with their Uncle Sam hat and the ring fuselage artwork. When Major William Thor and the Lafayette Escadrille became the 103rd Aero Squadron, they brought a record of triumphs and much-needed experience to the American Air Service. Along with him came Captain Field Kindley, who shot down 12 enemy planes, as did Captain Elliott Springs with 9 kills. The ace of American aces was former race car driver Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, who ran up an amazing 26 kills in air combat. Before the war, Eddie worked for Fred Duesenberg and drove his cars in the Indianapolis 500. Touted as the first man to drive a mile a minute, he received the sobriquet Fast Eddie. Rickenbacker raced in the 1912, 1914, 1915, and 1916 Indianapolis 500s. Most men chosen for pilot training had degrees from prestigious colleges. Rickenbacker had to struggle to gain permission to fly because he only finished the 7th grade. Because of his mechanical abilities, Rickenbacker was assigned as engineering officer in a flight training facility where he practiced flying during his free time. At 27, Rickenbacker was old by pilot standards and only made it into the Flying Corps on Billy Mitchell's special recommendation. He didn't fit in with the more educated, highbrow colleagues.
Fighting in the air is not sport. It's scientific murder. Captain Edward Rickenbacker, U.S. Army Air Service.
But what did set right with them and with his superiors was Rickenbacker's astounding ability in the air. Rickenbacker relished his victories and kept careful track. By October 1918, he supplanted Lufberry as America's top ace and was appointed commander of the 94th Squadron. Rickenbacker's 26 victories remained the American record until World War II. Frank Luke Jr. was born May 19, 1897, in Phoenix, Arizona. Following America's entry into World War I, he enlisted in the Aviation Section, U.S. Army Signal Corps, on September 25, 1917. In March of 1918, He went to France and was assigned to the 27th Aero Squadron. Luke was disliked by some for his tendency to occasionally fly alone and disobey orders. But the 27th was understanding orders to destroy German observation balloons, and Luke was willing to take on these hazardous targets. As soon as he took to the air, Luke began a remarkable string of victories. Between September 12th and September 29th, Luke was credited with shooting down 14 German balloons and 4 airplanes. Luke's 18 victories in just 10 sorties in 8 days was a feat unsurpassed by any pilot in World War I. Luke's final flight took place during the first phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. On September 28th, after achieving his 14th and 15th victories, that evening Luke flew to the front to attack 3 balloons in the vicinity of Dun-sur-Meuse, 6 miles behind the German lines. He dropped a message to a U.S. balloon company to observe his attacks, and then shot down the enemy balloons. As he turned his plane to head back to the American lines, he was severely wounded by machine gun fire from a German hilltop, a mile east of the last balloon site he had attacked. He immediately landed in a field just west of the small village of Mervaux. Luke ran toward a small stream, but collapsed some 200 feet from his airplane. As German infantry approached, Luke drew his pistol and fired. Luke died fighting to the end. On September 30th, the Germans buried Luke in the Mervaux cemetery. Rickenbacker said of Luke, "He was the most daring aviator and greatest fighter pilot of the entire war. His life is one of the brightest glories of our air service." He went on a rampage and shot down 14 enemy aircraft, including 10 balloons, in 8 days. No other ace, even the dreaded Richthofen, had ever come close to that. For his actions on the last day of his life, Luke was awarded the Medal of Honor, the first airman to receive his country's highest award. In April of 1917, the Allies launched a joint ground offensive, with the British attacking near Arras in Artois, northern France, while the French Nivelle offensive was launched on the Aisne. Their air forces were called on to provide support, predominantly in reconnaissance and artillery spotting. The Battle of Arras began on April 9, 1917. In support, the RFC deployed 25 squadrons, totaling 365 aircraft, about a third of which were fighters. There were initially only 5 German Jastas in the region, but this rose to 8 as the battle progressed, some 80 or so operational fighter aircraft in total. Since September 1916, the Germans had held the upper hand in the perpetual contest for air supremacy on the Western Front, with the Albatros D-2 and D-3 outclassing the British and French fighters, charged with protecting the vulnerable BE-2C, FE-2B, and Sopwith 1.5 Strutter 2-seater reconnaissance and bomber machines. The Allied fighter squadrons were equipped with obsolete pushers, such as the Airco DH-2 and FE-8, and other outclassed types such as the Nieuport 17. Only the SPAD S-7 Sopwith pup and triplane could compete on equal terms with the Albatros, but these were few in number and spread along the front. The new generation of Allied fighters were not yet ready for service, although No. 56 Squadron RFC with the SE-5 was working up to operational status in France. The Bristol F-2A also made its debut with No. 48 Squadron during April, but lost heavily on its very first patrol, with 4 out of 6 shot down in an encounter with 5 Albatros D-3s of Jasta 11, led by Manfred von Richthofen. During Bloody April, the British lost 245 aircraft, 211 aircrew killed or missing, and 108 as prisoners of war. The German air services lost 66 aircraft from all causes. As a comparison, in the 5 months of 1916's Battle of the Somme, the RFC had suffered 576 casualties. Under Richthofen's leadership, Jasta 11 scored 89 victories during April, over a third of the British losses. The month marked the lowest point of the RFC's fortunes. Despite the losses inflicted, the German air service failed to stop the RFC carrying out its prime objectives. The RFC continued to support the Army throughout the Arras offensive with up-to-date aerial photographs, reconnaissance information, and harassing bombing raids. In spite of their ascendancy, the German squadrons continued to be used defensively, flying for the most part behind their own lines. Thus, the Justice established air superiority, but certainly not air supremacy. Within a couple of months, the new technologically advanced generation of fighters entered service in numbers and quickly gained ascendancy over the overworked Jastas. As the fighter squadrons became able to once more adequately protect the slower reconnaissance and artillery observation machines, RFC losses fell and German losses rose. This was essentially the last time that the Germans possessed real air superiority for the rest of the war, although the degree of Allied dominance in the air certainly varied. As the young Yanks took to the sky in borrowed French Nieuports, and if they were lucky, a few worn-out Spad 8s, the country that first took to the skies struggled to catch up with an American warbird of its own.
America's airplane factories and us war workers didn't get started until late. To make airplane wings, they took house carpenters, furniture upholsterers, even seamstresses. Painters used varnish that smelled like bananas. After each plane was test flown, we tore it down for packing, under guard. Then, crated and addressed, it was sent off to the front.
In May 1918, the first American DH-4s were shipped in pieces from American factories to France, where parts were reassembled into the fighting craft, which helped sweep the enemy out of the sky. Only 8 months after they were ordered into production, they joined American aviators, ready for the big push. Germany launched its final offensive of the war on March 21, 1918. Using ground attack aircraft in support of the shock troops, the Germans were able to penetrate the Allied line in several places. Once again, the Kaiser's armies were driving on Paris. The air battles grew in fury to match the carnage on the ground. The Germans even sent their heavy Gotha bombers into the fight to attack key positions and supply dumps. With victory in sight, the German offensive ran out of gas. Literally. By June, flying missions were cut back due to the lack of fuel. While the Allies were able to replace lost aircraft and men, the Imperial German Air Service was not. American flyers were now arriving in the thousands. In July, the Allies went on the offensive. The Germans were swamped in the air by this influx of manpower and industrial might. By the time of the St. Mithil offensive in September, the Allies had complete control of the sky.
When the order came to prepare for battle, truckloads of aerial bombs were delivered to the planes. There, armorers fused the bombs and loaded the rigs. Then the boys who had to take them up made sure the job was done right.
From only 500 aircraft on all fronts in 1914, air power had grown to the point where U.S. General Billy Mitchell commanded a force of 1,500 British, French, and American aircraft over a small sector of the Western Front.
It was the big push. When we lifted the flaps that September morning in 1918, everything was ready. For the dawn takeoffs, we put flares on our wingtips. Billy Mitchell had asked for every airplane that could fight, and we brought him out. All the Allied force on the continent gave its planes. General Mitchell called for 1,500, and we actually got 1,481 off the ground. Wooden props bit into the air, and the engines roared as we began to rev up. Our mission was to control the skies above the San Miguel sector. This was the First Army's field of battle. Some had orders to bomb and strafe enemy installations, others to engage the Germans in the air. This was it.
Each pilot had been carefully briefed for his part in the mission. U.S. aviators and 609 American planes, now a solid part of the Allied air power, rose to attack. They supported troops on the ground, struck airfields, and shot up observation balloons, burning them out of the sky.
It was a slower, more personal kind of air war than we're used to now. Combatants could see each other's eyes, and when an aircraft headed down, its attacker could watch his foe struggle to escape. A pilot signaled that he had made another kill, and after a victory roll, he joined his buddies.
The German airmen, short of supplies and exhausted from too many missions, never gave up. In fact, they inflicted heavier losses than they suffered. But in the end, valor was not enough. On November 11, 1918, the Great War ended. The war cost an estimated 9 million lives. Of those, some 15,000 were airmen. Flight had lost its innocence. The 4 years of war brought about many new innovations in aircraft. Many of the World War I aces stayed in aviation after the war, turning in their uniforms for civilian suits. The ex-aces formed the backbone of the emerging aviation industry, which included postal airmail services, civilian air travel, and a new form of entertainment provided by pilots who barnstormed across the countryside, performing daredevil feats.